Robert Stevenson took the Northern Lighthouse Board's aspirations to a whole new level. Where his stepfather and father-in-law, Thomas Smith, built the NLB's first lighthouses, Robert effectively built a strong foundation for the lighthouse service well into the future. Not only did he construct highly successful lighthouses, he manned them with an efficient band of keepers, which he organized along military lines. And he brought up his sons with a similar degree of discipline. Young Bob broke the mold to become a surgeon in the army, but his other surviving sons were encouraged into the family engineering firm, building not just lighthouses, but harbours, breakwaters and bridges, amongst other public works. The eldest son, Alan, was born in 1807 and had developed a distinct classical bent, but wasn't of particularly robust health. At the age of 12, he joined his father on one of his inspection voyages round the coast, became his apprentice just 3 years later, and then began assisting in the building of lighthouses. In 1830, he assumed the role that his father had once held, that of Clerk of Works to the Northern Lighthouse Board. It was around this time that the Lighthouse Board moved into premises at 84 George Street in Edinburgh, in Edinburgh's new town, where it remains to this day. The Stevenson firm of engineers occupied the floor above. Robert retired in 1843 at the age of 70 and died 7 years later, when Alan assumed the role of the NLB's chief engineer. Ships had been foundering for a long time on the treacherous reef of Skerryvore, a dozen miles south of the island of Tiree. In 1834, the Northern Lighthouse Board undertook to build a lighthouse on it, and Robert was charged his son with the task. Alan was 8 years younger than his father had been when he built the Bell Rock. Sir Walter Scott, a family friend, had considered it to be a most desolate position for a lighthouse. The Bell Rock and Eddystone are a joke to it. Alan proposed a taller tower than the Bell Rock. At 48 metres tall, it is still the tallest in Scotland, but of course it demanded twice the amount of granite. So a quarry had to be opened up in Heriot, near Mull, and it also necessitated a harbour and an accommodation block built on Tiree. The whole project cost £87,000, which would be £5 million in today's terms. It took 7 years to complete, and many regard it as the most elegant lighthouse in the world, a triumph of engineering. I was lucky enough to sail past it at the end of May 2016 in Serenissima with Captain Luksha on our way from Tory Island to St Kilda, and a beautiful sunset it turned out to be. Skerryvore might be considered the pinnacle of Alan Stevenson's career. Indeed, it occupied a significant part of it, while his health continued to be an issue. He endeavoured to overcome it, as one single week of his busy schedule indicates. In May 1844, he set out from his desk in Edinburgh for Inverness, a coach journey which then took 20 hours. He visited lighthouses and sites, potential sites for others, from Cromarty all the way round the coast to Aberdeen and Fraserburgh, before he finally returned home via Dundee, all in the space of 8 days. This was only one of several such trips that year, which also included the annual inspection voyage in July, when he visited the Isle of Man. He received a ducking, landing at the Calf, and then another ducking a few days later at Cape Wrath Lighthouse. Such punishing schedules were undertaken by all the Stevenson Lighthouse engineers, but Allen in particular did not have the constitution to withstand them. Although most of his later lighthouses, a dozen in his short career, were never quite as challenging as Skerryvore, he was finally forced to retire in 1853 and died 12 years later in somewhat reduced circumstances at the age of 58. This is a family photograph with his brothers and their families, and you can see Alan in the center. Doesn't look a well man at all. His post was filled by the NLB by his brother David, who insisted he share it with the youngest brother, Thomas. They made a fine team. David, although not in the best of health himself, was the better engineer and a fine project manager. Thomas was very inventive, especially when it came to lighting, and indeed had been charged with fitting the optics to Allen's Skerryvore lighthouse. We remember him too for the invention of the meteorological Stevenson screen. He lived with his family at 17 Heriot Row in the new town, just round the corner from the NLB's headquarters in George Street. Thomas had been a reluctant apprentice, and being too bookish, he'd been chastised by his father for his writings. Give up such nonsense and mind your business. Thomas would be the man, remember, who never really accepted his own son, Robert Louis, ending his engineering apprenticeship to become the famous writer we know today. David and Thomas were to preside over what might be considered a golden age of lighthouse construction in Scotland. Together, they were responsible for 30 lighthouses. The company's new inventions were often trialled at a lighthouse their father had built on Inchkeith in the Firth of Forth, just off Edinburgh. And in fact, one of the new inventions they were looking at was a revolving light. In early days, the lights were fixed. And apparently one old lady in Edinburgh used to look out at the lighthouse during the night and sympathize with the poor old light keepers who seemed to be having to relight the light every few minutes as it revolved. The industry had largely replaced whale oil as fuel with the cleaner colza made from oilseed rape, and David was now actively promoting paraffin lamps. Their company also involved themselves in projects abroad, but in 1872, Thomas alone had to assume the bulk of the construction of the remote Duartach lighthouse on a notorious reef to the south of Skerryvore. Ill health finally forced David Stevenson to retire in 1883, and he died 2 years later. Thomas remained as chief engineer, but with only a single rebellious son to his name, he reluctantly found himself working alongside his nephew, David Allen. Together they were responsible for only 3 lights before Thomas himself died in 1887. Robert Louis Stevenson, his son, graciously wrote of him, "My father's services to lighthouse optics have been distinguished indeed. I might write books till 1900 and not serve humanity so well." David Allen, or David A, was to work closely with his own brother, Charles, although Charles would deal more with civil projects and only help on NLB tasks when necessary. Like their father and uncle, they complemented each other into a very efficient team, with a further 30 major lights completed. David A finally retired in 1938 and died a few months later, while Charles himself retired 2 years after that. With his son, Charles had been experimenting with other automatic navigational aids, talking beacons, undersea cables, even a prototype of radar. David had no sons, so it was left to Charles's son, David Allen, or D. Allen, as we'll call him, to carry the Stevensons' line into yet another generation, the fifth if we include Thomas Smith. Though the NLB didn't hire him as such, the feisty David Allen constructed Lighthouse for the Admiralty at the Dardanelles, for instance, during the First World War, and also for the independent Clyde Lighthouse Trust before he retired in 1952. He had become the family historian and wrote several books on lighthouse history. Sadly, he died in 1971, aged 80, before he had completed what was to be his magnum opus on his own family dynasty. Robert Louis Stevenson proudly observed how, whenever I smell salt water, I know that I am not far from one of the works of my ancestors. A later historian added, although they were responsible for so many brilliant inventions, not a single Stevenson ever seems to have taken out a patent. They could have been millionaires, but they chose to give their gifts to the world. I'm now going to indulge myself by giving you a whirlwind tour around the British Isles with some of my favourite photos of a few lighthouses that have interesting stories to tell. We'll start in Ireland, southwest Ireland, County Kerry, at Skellig Michael, which was built in 1826. On one occasion, the keepers had a blocked toilet, so decided to solve the problem with an explosive charge, normally used as a fog signal, and promptly blew the roof off the outside privy. In Northern Ireland, a lighthouse was established at the northwestern end of the island of Rathlin. Like others built on top of cliffs, it was obscured in fog and cloud. So, as only the Irish could, they positioned the beam of the light tower at the bottom rather than on the top of the tower. Having a red light further improved its effectiveness, as had been found elsewhere. Chicken Rock, at the southern tip of the Calf of Man, had long been a hazard, and since the Isle of Man fell under the jurisdiction of the Northern Lighthouse Board in Scotland, Robert Stevenson erected 2 lights in 1875. Sorry, in 1818, in alignment, so that together they pinpointed the dangerous rock offshore. A tower was finally built on the rock itself in 1875 and had to be automated in 1961 after a disastrous fire Ardnamurchan Point is the westernmost extremity of the British mainland, and it was lit by Alan Stevenson in 1849. His tower was adorned by modest decorations in classical or Egyptian style, which had always been a passion of his. Its beautiful holophytic optic, invented and installed by Thomas, has now been replaced, of course, by a revolving battery of sealed beam units. This is a similar one in Barra Head Lighthouse, which happens to be my favourite lighthouse, I think. It dominates the 750-foot headland on Burnery, the most southerly island of the Outer Hebrides, or Barra Head. The keepers told of rocks, even fish being thrown over its walls in severe storms. Robert Stevenson had carefully constructed the building inside an ancient Iron Age fort, while a neat circular wall was constructed to accommodate a burial ground and contains the sad graves of some lightkeepers' children. Young Donald Reid here died at only a week old. One of the most notorious lights in Scotland was on the highest point of the remote and lonely Flannan Isles, immortalised in a poem. It was built in the final years of the 19th century. Without any easy access, it was necessary first to construct 2 landing stages with concrete steps up the cliff face and a small gauge railway to the site. A pony had to be brought in to pull the wagons up to the lighthouse block. But sadly, when being taken off again, poor Billy struggled in his sling and plunged to his death. The rails met at what the keepers called Charing Cross, one from each of the landing stages. With lack of recent maintenance, neither landing offers a safe access nowadays, so it's not an option on cruises. And in winter storms, even summer storms, they became highly dangerous. And it was here that in December 1900, only a year after the lamp was lit, the 3 lightkeepers were washed away to their deaths by a freak wave. They were probably trying to secure the gear and may still have been unfamiliar with the local conditions. There's much speculation as to how the men vanished. Murder, suicide, pirates, even alien abduction. But all of that is firmly in the realms of fiction or poetic license. Having seen how exposed the West Landing is, there's no need to speculate anything other than a freak wave, perhaps rebounding out of the tunnel cave underneath, beside the landing stage. This is probably the last picture taken of the 3 men, only a week before during the visit of their superintendent. I've recently found out that one of the missing men, Thomas Marshall on the left, was from Ayrshire and had a grandfather whose surname was Love, and from the same part of Scotland as my own grandfather. So I have to research that to find out if there's a connection. I spent the night on the Flannans in June 1988 to catch and ring the rare leech's petrels which nest there. Far to the northeast, near Orkney, is an island memorialised in a famous folk song about the great Silkie of Skerry. Its lighthouse is no longer manned, of course, but the place is still inhabited by breeding grey seals and has one of the largest puffin colonies around the British coast. No fewer than 50,000 pairs. The northernmost outpost of the whole United Kingdom is Muckleflugga in Shetland. And not surprisingly, the Stephensons succeeded in erecting a lighthouse here in 1854. Once, when passing in a cruise ship, we had a marvelous encounter with a pod of killer whales, the orcas. The most northerly point of the British mainland is not, as popularly believed, John O'Groats, but Dunnet Head, a few miles west. Two foghorns have already tumbled over the cliff, and in this electronic age, the current one is now redundant. The most northeasterly corner of Aberdeenshire and Buchan is at Barra Head, where in 1895 they had to build a substantial stone base, accessible at low spring tides, to house the noisy foghorn, so that the resident keepers living above could get some sleep. I used to birdwatch here with one of the keepers, but Rattray became fully automatic in 1982. One of the first lighthouses I ever saw was on the Bass Rock in the Firth, east of Edinburgh. Back then in 1963, standing on the shore at Tantallon Castle, one might not be aware of the nesting gannets, which have bred there for hundreds of years or more. Nowadays, every corner of the rock is occupied, so that the Bass now houses the largest North Atlantic gannet colony in the world, 75,000 breeding pairs, no less. It's unlikely that any more could be squeezed in. Another famous cluster of lighthouses sit south of the border on the Northumberland coast at the Farne Islands, where in the 7th century, St. Cuthbert was a hermit who protected its wildlife, notably its eider ducks. But perhaps the Farnes' most celebrated human inhabitant was the lighthouse keeper's daughter, 23-year-old Grace Darling. On the night of the 7th of September 1938, with her father, she rowed a mile out into the teeth of a gale to rescue 13 passengers and crew from the wreck of the Forfarshire. One of the most photogenic lighthouses around the British coast must surely be the Needles on the Isle of Wight, where Noble Caledonia chartered a helicopter in August 2010 to take some promotional shots of island Skye. I happened to be on board at the time, so was able to get hold of some of the aerial shots. The last manned lighthouse in Scotland was built in 1958, but a program of automation of its lights was well underway. The very last light to be completed for automation was the South Light on Fair Isle in 1998. It was actually here that 2 keepers' wives, a child, and an army gunner were killed in 2 aerial attacks by the Luftwaffe in 1941 and 42. A plaque has been erected by the NLB to commemorate the tragedies. Nearby is another plaque which celebrates the invaluable service of generations of light keepers from 1787 at Kinnaird Head to here on Fair Isle on the 31st of March 1998, the last manned lighthouse in Scotland. It was unveiled with due ceremony by Princess Anne, who is the long-serving and loyal patron of the Northern Lighthouse Board. One might be tempted to question that in this age of satellite technology, lighthouses still have a role to play in marine navigation. Although a few have been decommissioned and keepers' accommodation sold off, most lights are still operational, monitored remotely, automatically, or even at the flick of a switch from the NLB headquarters in George Street in Edinburgh. I find two quotations particularly apt in this respect from ocean-going ship's masters. One said, "GPS tells me where the satellite thinks I am. A lighthouse tells me where I know I am." Even today, satellites are not infallible. Another captain noted appreciatively, "I have all the modern navigational equipment on board, but there's nothing more friendly and welcoming than the sight of a flashing lighthouse." Thank you.